The rain hammered against the windows of the black sedan as it pulled up to the curb. David Kim stared out at the small restaurant through the droplets racing down the glass. This was definitely not what he had planned for tonight. 2 hours earlier, he was supposed to be dining at Le Bernardin, the most expensive restaurant in Seattle. A table that cost more than most people made in a week, but a kitchen fire had shut the place down, and his assistant couldn't get him into any other five-star establishment on such short notice. "Sir, are you sure about this place?" his driver asked, glancing at the modest storefront. The neon sign read Angelina's Italian Kitchen in cursive letters, half of them flickering. David adjusted his tie and sighed. He was worth $3.2 billion, owned 4 companies, and had been featured on the cover of Forbes magazine 3 times. Yet here he was, about to eat dinner at a place that probably didn't even take reservations. "It's fine, Roberto. Just circle back in an hour." The bell above the door chimed as David stepped inside, immediately hit by the smell of garlic and oregano. The restaurant was nothing like his usual spots. Red checkered tablecloths covered small wooden tables. Fake grapevines hung from the ceiling. An old upright piano sat in the corner, covered in dust and topped with a wilted plant. But the place was warm. Genuinely warm in a way that his regular restaurants, with their perfect lighting and calculated ambiance, somehow never managed to be. "Good evening."
Table for one?
David turned to see a young woman approaching with menus tucked under her arm. She was probably in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and tired eyes that still managed to smile. Her name tag read Elena. "Yes, please. Somewhere quiet if you have it." Elena glanced around the half-full restaurant. Most of the diners looked like locals, families sharing plates of pasta, an elderly couple holding hands across their table, a group of construction workers still in their work clothes laughing over pizza. "Right this way." She led him to a corner table near the piano. As they walked, David noticed she moved with a certain grace despite the obvious exhaustion weighing on her shoulders. She set down the menu and pulled out a small notepad. "Can I start you with something to drink? We have a nice house wine, or I could recommend our Italian sodas." David almost asked for his usual, a glass of Chateau Margaux that would cost more than this woman's weekly salary. Instead, he found himself saying, "What would you suggest?" Elena paused, clearly not expecting the question. "Well, honestly, the house red is pretty good. Tony makes it himself from grapes his uncle grows in California. It's not fancy, but it tastes like family, if that makes sense." It didn't make sense to David. Wine was supposed to taste like wine, complex, refined, expensive. But something in Elena's voice made him curious. "I'll try it." As Elena walked away, David looked around more carefully. This wasn't just a restaurant, it was clearly someone's dream. Family photos covered one wall. Children's drawings were taped near the register. A sign by the kitchen read, "Nonna's Recipes Made with Love Since 1962. Elena returned with the wine. David took a sip expecting something harsh and cheap. Instead, he found something surprising. It was simple, yes, but honest. It tasted like what Elena had said. Family. "It's good," he said, and meant it. "I'm glad. Are you ready to order, or do you need a few more minutes? What do you recommend?" Again, that pause. Elena was clearly used to customers who knew exactly what they wanted, probably ordered the same thing every time they came in. "The lasagna is amazing tonight. The owner, Angelina, she makes the pasta fresh every morning. And the meatballs are her grandmother's recipe." She stopped, looking embarrassed. "Sorry, you probably don't need all that detail." "Actually, I do. Tell me more." For the next few minutes, Elena described the dishes with a passion that surprised David. She knew every ingredient, every story behind each recipe. When she recommended the tiramisu, she mentioned that Angelina's son delivered the coffee beans himself every Tuesday, from a roastery he found in Portland. "You really love this place," David observed. Elena's smile flickered for just a moment. "It's a good place to work. Angelina treats everyone like family." Something in her tone suggested there was more to the story, but David didn't push. He ordered the lasagna she'd recommended and settled back to wait. The restaurant continued to fill up as the evening progressed. David watched the other diners, fascinated. When was the last time he'd eaten somewhere where people actually talked to each other instead of staring at their phones? Where children laughed without being shushed? Where the owner, a round woman in her 60s who must be Angelina, came out of the kitchen to hug regular customers? How's everything tasting? Elena appeared beside his table as he finished the last bite. Incredible, David said honestly. Your friend Angelina knows what she's doing. She'd love to hear that. She worries constantly that people won't like the food. Why would she worry? This is better than half the restaurants I've been to that charge 10 times as much. Elena refilled his wine glass. You eat at a lot of expensive places. David hesitated. In his world, everyone knew who he was. His face had been on magazine covers, business news shows, conference stages. But Elena was looking at him like he was just another customer, and for some reason, he didn't want that to change. I travel a lot for work, he said simply. That must be nice. I've never really traveled anywhere. Where would you go if you could? Elena's eyes got a distant look. Vienna maybe, or Prague. Somewhere with beautiful old buildings and history. Before David could ask more, a crash came from the kitchen, followed by Angelina's voice shouting in rapid Italian. Elena immediately straightened up. Excuse me. I should go help. David watched her hurry toward the kitchen, noticing how the other staff members looked to her for guidance even though she seemed to be just a server. There was something about Elena that didn't quite fit. The way she carried herself, the way she spoke, even the way she described those far-off cities. As the evening wound down and the other customers gradually left, David found himself reluctant to call Roberto. He'd eaten at restaurants all over the world, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this relaxed, this normal. Elena appeared with his check, but before he could reach for his wallet, the lights suddenly dimmed, and Angelina emerged from the kitchen carrying a small cake with a single candle. Happy anniversary to Mario and Francesca, she called out to the elderly couple David had noticed earlier. The entire restaurant, all 6 remaining customers and the staff, began singing happy birthday. Not the polished, professional version from upscale places, but the real thing, slightly off-key and completely heartfelt. David found himself smiling as he watched Elena clap along. Her face lit up with genuine joy for these strangers celebrating their 52nd wedding anniversary. This, he realized, was what he'd been missing. David found himself lingering at his table long after Mario and Francesca had finished their anniversary cake and headed home. The restaurant had mostly emptied out, leaving just him and a young couple sharing dessert near the window. The warm lighting made everything feel golden and peaceful. Elena approached with a coffee pot. Refill, or maybe some tiramisu? I promise it's worth staying awake for. Actually, yes to both. David surprised himself. He hadn't eaten dessert in months. His personal trainer would probably faint. As Elena brought over a generous slice of tiramisu, she glanced toward the corner where the old piano sat. You know, most people don't even notice that thing anymore. David followed her gaze. Has it always been there? Since before I started working here. Angelina says it belonged to her grandmother. Used to be the centerpiece of the whole restaurant back in the day. Elena wiped down the table next to his. Apparently, Nonna Rosa would play every night after dinner service. Customers would stick around for hours just listening. What happened? Elena shrugged, but there was something wistful in her expression. Life, I guess. Nonna Rosa passed away about 10 years ago, and nobody else in the family really plays. It just sits there now, collecting dust. David studied the instrument more carefully. Despite the dust and the wilted plant on top, he could see it was actually a beautiful piece. The wood had a rich, warm tone, and the brass pedals still gleamed where someone had polished them long ago. Seems like a waste, he said. It is. Elena's voice was softer now. Music shouldn't just sit silent like that. There was something in the way she said it that made David look at her more closely. Do you play? Elena paused, cloth in hand. For a moment, her careful server's mask slipped, and David caught a glimpse of something deeper. Pain, maybe, or longing. I used to, she said finally. A long time ago. How long ago? She resumed wiping the table, avoiding his eyes. Long enough that my fingers have probably forgotten how. The young couple by the window stood up to leave, and Elena hurried over to clear their table. David watched her work, noting again that grace in her movements. There was something almost musical about the way she moved, precise, flowing like she was following some internal rhythm. When she came back, David had made a decision. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was the warm atmosphere of the place, but he felt more relaxed than he had in years, more willing to take chances. You know what? He said, gesturing toward the piano with his coffee cup. I bet that old thing still works. Elena glanced over. Probably. Angelina has it tuned once a year, just in case. She's hopeful someone will play it again someday. Well then. David stood up, walking over to the piano. He lifted the keyboard cover, revealing keys that were yellowed with age but still intact. I dare you to play something. Elena laughed, but it sounded nervous. Oh no, I couldn't. I'm working, and besides, I told you, it's been too long. Come on, David said, settling into a chair near the piano. The restaurant's practically empty. When's the last time you had a chance to play? I really can't. Elena's voice was firmer now, but David could see her eyes drawn to the keys despite herself. Tell you what, David said, leaning back in his chair with a grin. If you can play anything, and I mean anything, even happy birthday, I'll tip you $100. Elena stared at him. $100? For playing piano? For being brave enough to try something that scares you? The restaurant fell quiet except for the soft clinking of dishes as Angelina cleaned up in the kitchen. Elena stood frozen, looking between David and the piano like she was facing the most important decision of her life. You don't understand, she said quietly. It's not just that I'm out of practice. I can't or won't. Elena's hands clenched at her sides. It's complicated. David softened his approach. There was real pain in her voice now, and he felt bad for pushing. Sorry, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. Forget I said anything. But Elena wasn't looking at him anymore. She was staring at the piano keys with an expression David couldn't quite read. Hunger, maybe, or fear, or both. My mother used to say that music chooses you, she said suddenly. That once it gets into your blood, it never really leaves. Smart woman, your mother. She was. Elena's voice caught slightly. She always believed I had a gift. Said I was born to play. What happened? Elena was quiet for so long that David thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she said, life got in the way. Sometimes you have to choose between what you love and what you need to do. David felt something twist in his chest. He'd spent his entire career making choices based on need, on logic, on profit margins. When was the last time he'd done something just because he loved it? Maybe this is different, he said gently. Maybe this is just playing for fun. No pressure, no expectations. Just you and the music. Elena walked slowly toward the piano like she was approaching something dangerous. She stood beside the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys without touching them. I used to dream about playing, she whispered. Every night for months after I stopped. I'd wake up and my fingers would be moving like they were still playing. David held his breath, sensing that whatever happened next would be important. Elena sat down on the bench, adjusting its height with practiced movements that suggested she'd done this thousands of times before. She placed her hands on the keys but didn't press down. What if I'm terrible? She asked, looking at David with vulnerable eyes. Then you'll be terrible at something you love instead of perfect at something that doesn't matter. Elena smiled. The first genuine smile David had seen from her all evening. That's either very wise or very stupid. Probably both. She took a deep breath. Okay, but just something simple. David nodded, leaning forward in anticipation. Around them, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Even the sounds from the kitchen had stopped. Elena's fingers found the keys and she began with a single clear note that rang through the space like a bell. Then another. Then a simple melody that David didn't recognize but that somehow felt familiar, like a song he'd forgotten from childhood. But even in those first few notes, David could tell that Elena wasn't just someone who used to play. The way her hands moved, the way she felt for each key with perfect precision. This was someone who had lived and breathed music. As the melody developed, growing more complex, David realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just casual playing. This was artistry, and Elena, lost in the music, seemed to be coming alive for the first time all evening. The simple melody that Elena had started with began to change. What had been gentle and hesitant suddenly shifted into something else entirely. Her fingers moved faster, finding complex patterns across the keys with startling confidence. David sat forward in his chair. This wasn't the casual playing of someone who'd taken a few lessons years ago. This was something completely different. Elena's posture changed as she played. The tired waitress who had served him dinner seemed to disappear, replaced by someone David didn't recognize. Her back straightened, her shoulders relaxed, and her hands moved across the keyboard with the fluid precision of a dancer. The melody grew richer, more intricate. David found himself holding his breath as Elena's left hand began weaving in complex bass patterns, while her right hand danced through cascading runs of notes that seemed impossible to play. Yet she made it look effortless. From the kitchen came the sound of dishes being set down. Angelina appeared in the doorway, her face frozen in shock. She'd probably heard the piano countless times when her grandmother played, but this was something beyond even those memories. Elena was completely lost in the music now. Her eyes were closed and her whole body swayed slightly with the rhythm. The piece she was playing seemed to tell a story. Moments of joy that suddenly turned melancholy. Quiet sections that built to passionate climaxes, all woven together with a skill that left David speechless. The young couple who had been preparing to leave stopped at the door. They turned back toward the piano, their expressions mirrors of David's amazement. How was this possible? How was their waitress playing music that belonged in the world's greatest concert halls? As the piece reached its climax, Elena's hands flew across the keys in a display of technical brilliance that made David's heart race. The notes came so fast they seemed to blur together, yet every single one was crystal clear. The old piano, despite its age, responded to her touch like it had been waiting years for someone who truly understood how to bring it to life. David realized his mouth was hanging open. In his world, he was surrounded by exceptional people, Nobel Prize winners, Olympic athletes, artists whose work sold for millions. But he had never witnessed raw talent like this. Elena wasn't just playing the piano. She was speaking through it, telling a story that went deeper than words ever could. The music began to soften, winding down toward what David sensed would be the ending. But instead of finishing, Elena transitioned seamlessly into another piece, something even more complex and beautiful. Her fingers found melodies within melodies, harmonies that seemed to come from some otherworldly place. Angelina walked slowly into the dining room, tears streaming down her face. She sat down at a nearby table, never taking her eyes off Elena. David wondered if she was remembering her grandmother, or if she was simply witnessing something she'd never expected to see in her little restaurant. The second piece built to an emotional peak that sent chills down David's spine. Elena's whole body was involved now. Her shoulders, her arms, even her breathing seemed to be part of the music. She played with a passion that was almost painful to watch, like she was pouring years of suppressed emotion into every note. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the music stopped. Elena's hands remained on the keys for a moment, trembling slightly. The silence in the restaurant was absolute. Even the sounds from the street outside seemed to have stopped. David realized he had tears in his eyes. He couldn't remember the last time music had moved him like that. He couldn't remember the last time anything had moved him like that. Elena slowly opened her eyes and looked around as if waking from a dream. She seemed surprised to find herself at the piano, surprised to see everyone staring at her with expressions of pure amazement. She began, then stopped. She looked down at her hands like she couldn't believe what they had just done. David started clapping. It began as a slow, reverent applause, but within seconds Angelina joined in, then the young couple by the door. The sound echoed through the small restaurant like thunder. Elena stood up quickly, her face flushing red. "I should get back to work," she mumbled, moving away from the piano. "Wait," David said, standing up. "Elena, what was that?" "What do you mean?" She was back in waitress mode. But David could see through the facade now. He'd seen who she really was, that music, those pieces. What were they? Elena glanced toward Angelina, who was still wiping tears from her eyes. "Just things I remembered." "You don't just remember music like that," David said gently. "That was Chopin's Ballad No. 1, wasn't it? And then you went into Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Those are pieces that take years to master." Elena's eyes widened. "You know classical music? My mother was a piano teacher. I grew up listening to those pieces, but I've never heard them played like that. Not even by professionals." The young couple approached, still looking stunned. "Excuse me," the woman said to Elena. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Are you a concert pianist?" Elena laughed, but it sounded hollow. "No, I'm a waitress." "But you can't be just a waitress," the man said. "Nobody plays like that without serious training. That was Carnegie Hall level playing." Elena's composure began to crack. I really need to get back to work, she said, her voice shaky. Angelina finally spoke up. Elena, cara mia, in 30 years of running this restaurant, I have never heard anything so beautiful. Not even when my Nonna Rosa played. She stood up and walked over to Elena, taking her hands. Where did you learn to play like that? Elena looked around the room at all the faces staring at her expectantly. David could see the internal battle playing out across her features. The desire to disappear warring with something else, something that had been awakened by the music. I studied at Juilliard, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air like a bombshell. David felt his understanding of everything shift. Juilliard wasn't just any music school. It was the most prestigious conservatory in the world. Getting in was nearly impossible. Graduating meant you were among the best musicians on the planet. Juilliard, Angelina breathed. But then why are you working here? Elena finished. Because life doesn't always go according to plan. David's mind was racing. The woman who had been serving him dinner, who had recommended the house wine and described the lasagna with such care, was a world-class musician. Someone who should have been performing on stages around the globe was instead taking orders and clearing tables in a small Seattle restaurant. Elena, he said carefully, what happened? Why aren't you performing? For a moment he thought she might answer, but then her defenses went back up and the waitress mask slipped back into place. It's getting late, she said, and I should really close out your check. But as she walked toward the register, David noticed something different about her. The way she held herself had changed. For those few minutes at the piano, she had remembered who she really was. And now, even as she tried to go back to being just a waitress, David could see that the music had awakened something in her that couldn't easily be put back to sleep. David couldn't let it go. As Elena walked toward the register, trying to return to her role as just another waitress, he followed her. The young couple had left, still talking excitedly about what they'd witnessed. But David remained, along with Angelina, who was still wiping tears from her eyes. Elena, please, David said as she fumbled with the check. You can't just play like that and pretend it's nothing. It was just muscle memory, Elena said without looking up. Like riding a bike. Nobody rides a bike like that, Angelina interjected, her Italian accent stronger than usual with emotion. Madonna mia, I have never heard such beautiful music in my life. Elena's hands were shaking as she tried to calculate David's bill. The numbers seemed to blur together on the paper. Finally, she set down her pen and looked up at him. Why does it matter to you? She asked. You're just a customer. Tomorrow you'll go back to your life and forget all about this place. David pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. Elena's eyes widened as she saw his photo on a Forbes magazine cover from 6 months ago. The headline read, Tech Titan David Kim building tomorrow's world. I'm not just any customer, he said gently. And I won't forget this. How could I? Elena stared at the phone, then at David's face, then back at the phone. You're David Kim, the billionaire. I am. But right now I'm just someone who witnessed something extraordinary and wants to understand how a Juilliard graduate ends up serving lasagna instead of performing at Carnegie Hall. Angelina gasped. Juilliard? Elena, is this true? Elena closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, the last of her walls seemed to crumble. She looked suddenly exhausted, like she'd been carrying a weight for too long. Yes, it's true, she said quietly. I graduated 5 years ago. Top of my class, and? David prompted gently. Elena walked over to one of the tables and sat down heavily. David and Angelina joined her, sensing that whatever came next would be important. I had everything planned out, Elena began, her voice distant. After graduation, I was supposed to go on tour with the London Symphony Orchestra. I'd won 3 international competitions. My professor said I was the most promising student he'd taught in 20 years. She paused, staring at her hands, those same hands that had just created magic on the piano keys. The week before I was supposed to leave for London, my mother called. She'd been having headaches, problems with her balance. The doctors thought it was stress at first. David felt his stomach drop, sensing where this story was heading. It wasn't stress, Elena continued. It was something called progressive supranuclear palsy. It's a rare brain disease that affects movement and balance. There's no cure. Angelina reached across the table and took Elena's hand. Oh, Kara. The doctors said she had maybe 2 years if we didn't try experimental treatments. With the treatments, maybe 5 or 6 years. But the treatments weren't covered by insurance. They cost about $15,000 a month. David did quick mental math. $15,000 a month meant $180,000 a year. For a classical musician just starting their career, that might as well have been $1 million. So you gave up the tour, he said. Elena nodded. I gave up everything. The London Symphony, my agent. My apartment in New York. I moved back to Seattle to be closer to Mom and took the first job I could find that had good health insurance. Here, Angelina said softly. Here, Elena confirmed. You hired me even though I had no restaurant experience. You said I looked like someone who needed a chance. Angelina's eyes filled with tears again. I had no idea. The insurance covered some of the treatments, but not all. So I got a second job at a coffee shop downtown. Between the two jobs, I was working about 70 hours a week. Every penny went to Mom's care. David leaned forward. And you stopped playing completely? I had to. There was no time, and honestly, it hurt too much. Every time I sat at a piano, I thought about everything I'd given up. The life I was supposed to have. The music I was supposed to share with the world. Elena's voice cracked. It felt like mourning something that was still alive. But you kept the skills, David observed. What you played tonight, that doesn't come from muscle memory alone. Elena smiled sadly. I practiced in my head. Every night when I came home from work, I'd lie in bed and play entire concerts in my mind. My fingers would move on my blanket like there were keys there. It was the only way I could stay sane. Your mother must have been grateful, Angelina said. She was, but she was also heartbroken. She knew what I'd given up for her. Sometimes I'd catch her crying when she thought I wasn't looking. Elena wiped her eyes. She always said music was my gift to the world and I was wasting it. She was wrong, David said firmly. Love like that isn't a waste. It's the most beautiful gift you could have given her. Elena looked at him with surprise. You really think so? I know so. I've built companies worth billions, but I've never done anything as meaningful as what you did for your mother. The treatments helped, Elena continued. Instead of 2 years, she had 4 good years. We got to travel a little, spent time together, made new memories. She got to see me grow up in ways I never would have if I'd stayed focused only on my career. And now? David asked gently. Elena was quiet for a long moment. She passed away 8 months ago, peacefully, at home, with me holding her hand. The restaurant fell silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. David felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition of loss and sacrifice that his privileged life had never required him to understand. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it more deeply than any condolence he'd ever offered. Thank you, Elena said. The hardest part is that I don't know what comes next. I've been taking care of her for so long that I forgot how to take care of myself. I keep working here because it's all I know how to do now. But tonight you played again, David pointed out. Tonight was different, Elena admitted. Something about the way you challenged me, the way you made it feel safe to try again. For those few minutes I remembered what it felt like to be myself. That's who you still are, Angelina said firmly. The music is still inside you. I heard it tonight. Elena looked at both of them. This billionaire who had wandered into her restaurant and this surrogate mother who had employed her without question. For the first time in months, she didn't look quite so tired. I don't even know where I would start, she said. It's been 4 years since I performed professionally. The classical music world moves fast. Everyone's probably forgotten I ever existed, David smiled. Elena, after what I heard tonight, I can promise you something. The world hasn't forgotten. It's just been waiting. David sat back in his chair, looking at Elena with the same intensity he usually reserved for business deals worth millions. But this wasn't about money. This was about something far more valuable. What if I told you that tomorrow you could walk into any concert hall in the world, and they would beg you to perform? He asked. Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'd say you're being kind, but you don't understand how this industry works. 4 years away might as well be 40. There are hundreds of young pianists graduating from conservatories every year, all fighting for the same opportunities. You're right, David said. I don't understand the music industry, but I understand talent and I understand how to make things happen. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Do you know who Patricia Chan is? Elena's eyes widened. She's the artistic director of the Seattle Symphony Orchestra. She's also one of the most respected programmers in classical music. She's also my ex-wife, David said simply. The silence that followed was thunderous. Angelina's mouth fell open, and Elena stared at David like he'd just told her he could fly. Your ex-wife runs the Seattle Symphony? Elena whispered. We divorced 8 years ago, but we remained friends. Patricia always said I had no soul for music, but she respected that I supported the arts. David was already typing a text message. She owes me a favor or two. David, no, Elena said, panic creeping into her voice. You can't just call in favors for someone you met 3 hours ago. This is crazy. The crazy thing would be letting talent like yours go to waste, David replied, hitting send on his message. There, I've asked her to meet us for coffee tomorrow. Elena stood up abruptly. I can't, I have to work tomorrow. I have shifts here and at the coffee shop. Angelina cleared her throat. Actually, Kara, you don't have a shift here tomorrow. You asked for the day off, remember? You said you had something important to do. Elena stared at her boss. I did not ask for— You did, Angelina said firmly, winking at David. And at the coffee shop, too. I called your manager there while you two were talking. Told him you had a family emergency. But I need those shifts. I need the money. David reached into his wallet and pulled out a credit card. What's left on your mother's medical debt? Elena's face flushed red. I am not a charity case. You're right. You're an investment. David's voice was gentle but determined. The last piece you played tonight, the Rachmaninoff. Do you know what tickets cost when Yu Wang performed it at Carnegie Hall last year? Elena shook her head. $300. For the cheap seats. The good seats were $800. And it sold out in minutes. David leaned forward. Elena, you're not just good. You're exceptional. World-class exceptional. And exceptional talent isn't charity. It's a gift that belongs to everyone. Elena sat back down, overwhelmed. Even if Patricia agrees to meet with us, even if she somehow gives me a chance, I'm not ready. I haven't performed in 4 years. I don't have the stamina, the stage presence, the repertoire prepared. So we get you ready. David said simply. How long would you need? For a full concert? 6 months, minimum. Maybe a year. Done. David was typing on his phone again. I know a rehearsal studio downtown. It has a Steinway grand piano, soundproofed rooms, practice time available 24 hours a day. David, I can't afford— I can. He looked up from his phone. Consider it an investment in something beautiful. Elena looked around the restaurant, at Angelina, who was crying again. At the old piano that had awakened something in her she thought was dead. At David, who was offering her a chance she'd never dared dream of again. Why? She asked quietly. Why would you do this for a stranger? David was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Do you know how I made my first billion? Elena shook her head. By creating software that helps hospitals manage patient data more efficiently. It saves lives, but it's not beautiful. It's necessary, but it doesn't make people feel the way you made me feel tonight when you played. He paused. I've spent my whole life building things that matter to the bottom line. I'd like to help build something that matters to the human spirit. Angelina stood up and walked over to Elena, taking her hands. Kara, when I hired you 4 years ago, I saw something in your eyes. Pain, yes, but also a light that wouldn't go out completely. Tonight I saw that light become a fire. Don't let it die again. Elena felt tears spilling down her cheeks. What if I fail? What if I'm not as good as I used to be? Then you'll practice until you are, David said. What if you succeed? What if you become everything you were meant to be? David's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and smiled. Patricia can meet us at 11 tomorrow morning. Her office at Benaroya Hall. Elena's breath caught. Benaroya Hall was home to the Seattle Symphony Orchestra. She'd dreamed of performing there since she was a child. She wants to hear you play. David continued, reading the message. She's setting up time with one of their rehearsal pianos. She's willing to audition me. Just like that. I may have mentioned that I heard someone tonight who reminded me why I fell in love with classical music in the first place. David grinned. Patricia always did love a good comeback story. Elena looked at her hands, the same hands that had served countless tables, made thousands of coffee drinks, and held her mother through her final moments. The same hands that had just played with a skill that left everyone speechless. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, I'll try. Angelina clapped her hands together. Bravissima. David stood up and extended his hand to Elena. Partners? Elena shook it, feeling something she hadn't felt in 4 years. Hope. Partners, she agreed. 3 months later, David sat in the front row of Benaroya Hall as Elena walked onto the stage wearing a black evening gown. The hall was sold out. Patricia had programmed Elena's debut concert as part of the symphony's Emerging Artists series. As Elena sat at the gleaming Steinway grand piano, David remembered that night in Angelina's restaurant. The tired waitress was gone, replaced by an artist who had reclaimed her gift. Elena began to play the same Chopin ballade she'd started with that night, but now it filled a 2,000-seat concert hall. The audience was completely silent, captivated by the same magic David had witnessed over his tiramisu. When the piece ended, the applause was thunderous. As Elena stood to bow, she caught David's eye and smiled. Not the polite smile of a waitress, but the radiant smile of someone who had found her way home. Later at the reception, Patricia approached David. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For reminding me why we do this. Elena isn't just technically brilliant. She has something you can't teach. She makes people feel." David nodded, watching Elena talk excitedly with other musicians, her face glowing with joy. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important investments weren't measured in dollars and cents, but in dreams restored and gifts shared with the world. And sometimes, a chance encounter over dinner could change everything.